Hello, James. Thanks for coming. And hello, people. Today we have here James Lindsay
Hello.
coming to talk about his book with Peter Boghossian, How to Have Impossible Conversation, a very practical guide for real, and a little bit of Grievance Studies as well. So I would like to introduce you, talk a little bit about how people can get your work and follow you on Twitter as a conceptual James. Today, a funny nickname, a different one of multiple ones. I have followed you, and it's pretty interesting. So changing names constantly, likes big butts today.
Yeah, that's for Helen.
I think we match and would suggest you to go visit Brazil eventually.
Well, that sounds fun. I should go to Brazil. Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to ask about your Twitter is that your profile it's an apolitical guy. So,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that, and how do you explore that concept?
Well, I'm not actually as interested in politics as a lot of people think I am. There's different levels of politics, of course. Particularly, I'm not really interested in kind of the big picture electoral politics. Who's going to be in Congress? Who's going to be in Parliament? Who's prime minister? Who's president? What's going on with that? I don't really have a lot of interest in that and never have. So since the work that I do, especially tracking the grievance studies stuff, is so strongly associated with the political left, I decided that I want to just kind of position myself as not really taking a side politically. I guess if you put me on those political tests or whatever, I always come out pretty far on the left and pretty deep into the libertarian territory. But my project in terms of work, and then that's really kind of what Twitter is mostly for me, has very little to do with politics. Occasionally I'll comment on something, and I almost always regret having commented on something political. So I would rather kind of stay above the political fray. Now, of course, people see grievance studies as an inherently political project, and therefore being against grievance studies as being political. And I guess in some sense it is, but I say I'm apolitical primarily in the stance that I'm not taking a particular side with what I'm doing. I'm on the side of truth and academic rigor and being able to have a free and liberal society which can represent left, right, or center political positions.
That is really nice to hear. We need more people to talk apolitical in that sense, to not be partisan. I
Yeah,
think like you said, the political field in the United States nowadays, the spectrum, like the environment, it's just like a sinkhole. It drags everyone to be political, but and it wants to put people into those categories of left and right, and when you just bring in one factor of one position of all your beliefs of your political positions, they already want to categorize, are you left or you right, and attack you with that, because now to be left or right is actually an insult,
right.
apparently, depending on which side you are. So I think it's interesting that you brought up the how people take it, the study and the book itself as some type of political movement, but in fact is to be more would be the secularity of the political uh, field, no? Because like try to be reasonable without taking sides, without being ideological.
Right. Yeah, that itself in the present climate is considered a political position. And of course, from the kind of social justice perspective, they say that not taking a side is siding with systemic power and oppression on all of that. So they say that not taking a side is a side. But it's not, I mean, it's not exactly that I don't take a side. It's just that I take a side for me. I'm not taking a side for everybody else. Um, I I know how I tend to vote, or if it comes to that, and I know what politicians I tend to support, and they do happen to tend to fall to the left side of the spectrum as those things are come out. So it's kind of a disposition toward how I want to be with regard to telling other people how they should think, which is that I don't want to tell other people how they should think.
Yes, I understand that. But it's funny because we can actually change the words and say, like, instead of left and right, go back to actually what they mean. That is more on individual or collective responsibility. And we do have the problem, I believe, more with the left that kind of crashed because of the ideologies that pop up inside and want to drive and manipulate data into their narrative. And I think that is also the importance of these studies, that a lot of people diminish or do not recognize that there is this importance of nowadays. Like, I don't know, I think I talked a little bit more with Helen about this on like the postmodernists, because it is her field, and how this ideology and theory-based studies infiltrate the academia, and then that we pass maybe through some 90s decades of studies being recognized as some type of authority. So we like, oh, if you bring a scientific study, people would before like, oh, I don't know about that. And then we pass through the modern period where people recognize that they have some validity. But and now we are in the postmodern era where not all studies are valid or have a proper methodology, and that's why we have to go deeper on study understanding than just like, oh, here, show a scientific study, and everybody just not, like, bends over and it's like, yeah, it's valid and it's factual.
Right.
The insurgence of like a pseudoscience and all these theory-based studies in all the fields, it's an important thing that I think a lot of people are just like ignoring or do not recognize that there are so many studies in this way, and then that the Grievance studies came to bring this to the conversation.
Right. Right. Yeah, that was ultimately what our purpose was to show that at least within some parts of the academy that there are some really serious lapses upon rigor. In fact, they don't even fail to rely on rigor. They're actively hostile to the idea of rigor. And that because of that, it's easy to pass off opinion as though it's, something scientific or something with actual scholarly merit. And I think we were pretty successful at that.
Okay, surviving to the crashes. Keep going. So we talked about the importance of the studies in the academia, to question all the studies, and a little bit on that individual and collective responsibility. And I think it brings again back to we know the studies nowadays have to be like revised individually, and each person individually as well, to go through the studies and check where are the biases, and if this study is valid in the end. So about the book and the studies, you guys pissed a lot of people off, no? So how is this censorship and cancel culture, and how do you feel and understand and represent about that? Did you not get anything? Oh, am I frozen? No, it's not working. Hello?
I'm sorry, it looks like it froze again for a few minutes.
Oh, okay, because I was like, made a
No,
question, and like, I
it's
don't know.
raining here, and when it rains here, our internet is unreliable.
Oh, okay, no problem. Yeah, sounds like Brazil. I actually don't feel much of this here in Canada. We have very good internet.
Yeah,
Where?
we in America.
Not to sharing that on the recording, anyways. But we're relatively close, no? Me, you.
Um,
Here?
No,
Are you in
no,
Portland
I'm
as well?
no, I'm in the southeast. I'm in Tennessee, so I'm a
Oh, okay,
long way
okay.
away.
No, but I
Yeah.
have done videos with people in Tennessee. I like to participate. I am friends of the group of street epistemology of Knoxville and
Oh,
the
really?
association. Yeah, I have interviewed the Larry Rhodes, that is
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah. I know Larry.
founder. Yeah, I talked to him. They always invite me to their radio podcast. I'll probably be there this Sunday. They're going to be talking about the pseudoscience, and the I think they will have someone involved on the Hail Satan
Hmm.
documentary. I don't know if
Ah,
you have
yeah.
watched. It's pretty good. It's all about the secularism of state and important conversations where we have more religiosity trying to get into politics. But I do think it is an important conversation here for Canada that we have El Sharia being passed as a party in already.
Wow.
Yeah, they have a party getting, I think 2 years ago when they registered the Muslim party, something like that.
Wow.
It's pretty sad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And unhappily, this is all politics' fault because Trudeau is very cultural relativist,
Yeah.
and yeah, he allows everything. There are like underage marriages in Canada because of religious freedom.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's it's pretty complicated nowadays. And if you say anything, you're just racist,
Oh, of course.
you're just Islamophobic or racist or xenophobic. It's pretty complicated. And I actually have been called out like, I can't believe you're an immigrant that is anti-immigration. It's like, no, I'm not anti-immigration. I'm for immigration, but I think there are proper ways to do it. And
Sure.
you know, so yeah, keep trying to record. We're still recording. I'll shave whatever is not necessary. Let's try to go back to the question.
Okay.
So I was talking about we were talking about the studies and the book, and that a lot of people have misunderstood the purpose, and even even our own statements on Twitter. That is kind of like the Poe's law.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
It's kind of natural. So, but I wanted to reach the censorship and cancel culture.
Mm.
How do you have experienced that?
Well, I'm really concerned about censorship and cancel culture. I'm most concerned, everybody's kind of really concerned about other people being censored. The things like deplatforming, somebody's invited to speak and then they take away that invitation or whatever. I'm actually more concerned about the pressure to self-censor, the pressure for people not to be honest about what they think about these things because they think they're going to get called a racist or they're going to get called something, some kind of an ist or a phobe or something. And so I am really concerned about that. And of course, the reason that people are concerned about that, they're slightly, on some level, concerned about being called names, I suppose. But it's much more that there is a real possibility of this cancel culture where you have, an online mob becomes angry enough at you where they can impact your, often your livelihood, or at least even your experience if you want to be an online person. Uh, Certainly, we've seen examples all over the place where people have lost their jobs or been fired or been pulled out of, say, the Senate or something like that because they had the wrong position or they did the wrong thing. And the mob came and yelled at them and continued until they finally gave in and apologized, at which point that was the end of them because an apology is how your cancellation begins. It's not how you stop yourself from being canceled. So, yeah, I'm really concerned about that social pressure that mostly exists because of the ability on social media to harass people anywhere in the world right now. And in fact, to find out who their employers are or sometimes their family members and harass those people, um, trying to cancel them, to punish them for thinking or saying the wrong things. So I'm really concerned about that. Um, especially since a lot of the reason that this happens is because, if we want to kind of tie it back to the studies that we did, or that we tried to expose, is that a lot of the reasons that people get canceled and bullied don't even really make sense. Like I mentioned before, it's people are afraid of being called a racist. Well, for what? And the fact is that the people who engage, well, it's not the only people. It turns out people on the fringes of any political orientation will engage in cancel culture if you transgress the wrong boundaries. But the people on the far left who are doing it are using entirely different definitions of racism than most people use, and then they're using the social stigma of the usual definition of racism to their advantage to do it, which is kind of this little trick that they're playing. They mean racist in the sense of this vague social system of power and dynamics, and that if you participate in that, then somehow you're racist. Whereas most people feel that racism means, discriminating against somebody on the basis of their ethnicity. And those two things aren't the same thing, but the cancel culture often proceeds by blurring those lines. It also, proceeds for other reasons, like whether there was a lot of it in the Me Too movement, for example. It was that if somebody was found to be guilty of any manner of sexual behavior, pretty much, that somebody decided was unwanted or inappropriate, or decided was unwanted or inappropriate after the fact or on somebody else's behalf, and sometimes, of course, very legitimate sexual assault, violence, or rape. In all such cases, everybody was to be treated as an intolerable supporter of sexual violence against women. And, many people were canceled, as it were, over that. So I mentioned, for example, Al Franken. I mentioned the Senate. So Al Franken is the senator that would have been relevant. And when he was previously acting as a comedian, if I get the story right, he, took some relatively comedic pictures, or maybe he's being a jerk, I don't know, with, it turns out, a conservative model. And then once cancel culture and Me Too revved up, the conservative model was able to push the issue. Leanne Tweeden was her name, and ended up getting him canceled from the Senate. It's like the biggest backfire for progressivism. I think the most obvious backfire for progressivism that I think I've ever seen, where they had their own tool used against them extraordinarily successfully. So yeah, there's a lot to be concerned about with that. We really need to be able to discuss issues openly and plainly. We shouldn't have to fear for our livelihoods to engage in free speech. So, if the freedom of speech is enshrined in law, that's good, and that's an ultimate protection. But if the saying is usually something like, you're free to say whatever you want, but you're going to suffer consequences for it. But when you can actually mobilize a significant portion of society in essentially a harassment mob to effect kind of an extra legal punishment for somebody and maybe end their career or something like that, there's a real chilling effect on free speech that comes along with that. And then again, you get the self-censorship. I don't know how many I get per week, but I know that in the last year and a half or so, it's been well over 1,000, maybe several thousand emails or messages from people telling me about how much they have to self-censor, or that they support the work I'm doing but don't tell anybody. They want to send a note of support but don't let anybody know that I said that because I could lose my job. Here's something I'd like for you to share and draw attention to, but don't say where you got it because I could lose my job. Or in many cases, I'll even get, here's this crazy thing that's happening, and I just want you to be aware of it, but please don't share it just in case it can be traced back to me and I lose my job. So I know that there's a huge pressure for self-censorship.
I know I hear that all the time in different ways, because I'm always talking about something that is pissing something. And normally what I hear is the same thing, like, please don't tell other people, because in my example, for those people that are contacting me, it's an example of what they do not want to go through.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
like, I know the pressure you suffer. I'm gonna send you this, talk about this. I like your work, but see why I don't want to do it? I heard this when I was in Brazil as being an atheist, because in Brazil it's a heavily religious country,
Mm-hmm.
and I suffered prejudice at work, family, colleagues, friends, lost friends, and some close friends at work would tell me like, I don't believe, but I can't tell my mom, and you see why I don't come out of the closet, because you just experience what I don't want to go through. So it's pretty common, and I think it's sad because yesterday I was talking to a friend, and I told her that I can't understand this cognitive dissonance of us have gone through like recently dictatorship. We have people alive nowadays that have gone through those regimes and know how that is bad, and we're still talking about censorship in the internet as something new, as something that we have never talked about on the Inquisition and then on the dictatorship, and then we decide that no, free speech is better. Even the cancel culture doesn't need to be shut down because they can speak and people listen to them, like, and that doesn't make sense. I don't want to live under this type of life or
Yeah,
regime.
yeah, yeah.
Even Peter brought it up. It's like, I don't even want to stop the cancel culture from propagating their stuff because free speech, but it is a big battle of nowadays.
Yeah,
um
yeah, yeah. So the thing is I agree with Peter there. I don't want to stop them from being able to say what they want to say or to try to exact those social consequences even. But on the other hand, one thing that seems to be coming more and more clear is that unless they can get a hold of your employer and put enough pressure on your employer to affect some material change, they can't cancel you until you decide that you're canceled. It just seems to be the case. My Twitter is kind of a hellhole. I get a lot of people trying to essentially drive me away from using Twitter if I had to guess what their purpose is and
yeah.
smear me. I get a lot of really bad behavior directed in my direction. And good for them, I suppose. That's why the mute button exists. I don't actually see almost any of it anymore unless I hit a really big one. But what people should understand is that it's just people making noise. It's a sound and fury signifying nothing. Shakespeare. It goes away. It goes
It
away.
is the loudest minority.
It's true. It's actually
It's just
surprisingly,
scary.
it's so often, to be honest, when you're on social media too, a lot of people don't seem to realize this, but I've noticed that when I get these kind of outrage mobs at me, it's overwhelmingly the same people. It's when you say it's the loudest
The
minority.
bots.
Uh, well, there are bots, of course, and that's one thing. Is who care? If you have a reasonable expectation that these things are bots, then there's no reason to take what it's saying seriously because it's a bot or a paid troll or something. But the people who throw shade at me the most consistent, it's the same group of maybe for me maybe a couple hundred people over and over and over and over again. It's the same ones. So it's like, you get this perception that all this stuff's coming at you and people are coming after you and that there's just thousands and thousands of people who are against you. But in reality, it's kind of often just a handful of dedicated people who go around looking for trouble in that regard. And that when you realize that it's kind of easy to ignore them.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a little mob. It's like the hate followers. I call them the
Hate
hate followers.
followers. That's right.
I
Well,
have
hate
I
followers
have
need to
I have
realize that
more hate
they
followers
spread
that
your
do
message
not.
for you. You say you have four?
I have more hate
Oh,
followers that
more.
do not really follow me, but to come by almost every day to leave you a message, to
Yeah, I
send you
have those.
something, to tell you they are gonna dislike and stop you from talking.
Yep, I have those too. They call me names. They say all these crazy things. They detect that I have sock puppets that I don't have. All kinds of stuff. It's the most ridiculous thing ever.
I have been accused of several things, but it is interesting. One of the things it's important to talk about the impossible conversations. And I brought up when you're talking with Peter was like that impossible conversations, not to harass people, to have to talk to you when they are not willing to do. No, not chase people on the streets,
Yeah.
trying to take some words from them. It is the difficulty of finding a common ground, and
Mhm.
it is that difficult for everyone nowadays to get a common ground in some topic, like it's just everything is so polarized.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's one of the things that's interesting is like this difference of people in real life and on in the internet. We have actually talked about this through messages because of the trolls, because I think sometimes we also assume the troll position online. I think is kind of a natural. Sometimes we are playing, sometimes we are being serious, but it's very difficult to get that through messages, and it's something that you also talk about the book. Can you talk a little bit how like trolls be or not to be, when and what to do with that?
Yeah, it's really difficult because trolling and playing around like that is fun and it's sometimes appropriate, but the message doesn't always come across really well. So people will often misunderstand something you said that's tongue in cheek, say, especially on social media where it's out publicly. You may say something tongue in cheek and then they misinterpret it as though it's something serious. And sometimes it's just fun to say something to see if you can get a bit of a reaction out of people. And this, that's this kind of a social thing that people do, that there's a level of it where it's fine. But then on the other hand, you do have to be careful for it, and you have to make sure to, try to be a little bit responsible with your outgoing public messaging. When people are trolling you, however, there's almost no question about what to do. They are people who are seeking either to derail what's going on or to get your attention and waste your time. And so the only correct response is to ignore them. And in fact, if I were the one, say, that was deciding I wanted to put something kind of funny out and troll people a little bit, like, for example, saying that I like big butts on Twitter was kind of to troll Helen. Um, I'm just kind of having, fun with her or whatever on a topic. And then, but if I'm going to do that, then I have to also adopt a mentality that I don't expect to be taken seriously about it. And so I think kind of the line should be that if there's going to be some trolling, that it should really be in good fun. And of course, a lot of the people who do a lot of trolling are teenagers, and their idea of fun isn't quite fully developed and mature yet. But in general, for the more adult among us, and even teenagers who are paying attention, you really do want to try to steer toward making sure that, the idea of trolling should be that it's kind of in good fun for sort of everybody. And when you're outside of that, you really probably should hedge toward not doing it. And when you are encountering it, if again, it's not kind of like a let's all have good fun together
Yeah.
mentality, then just don't engage it. That's really kind of, it's a difficult thing because it's a natural human thing to do, like just, and there are purposes and sometimes value to it. For example, the changing of my name on Twitter, depending on what it is often me trolling somebody who's trolling me. And so they try to call me a name, or they tell me that I'm stupid, or they tell me that I'm whatever, and then I just adopt that as part of my online identity, kind of in a way to give them the middle finger, if you will, and kind of also as a way to say, people who are coming on and insulting me don't have any power over me. It's like, okay, you
Yeah.
called me this name, now it's my name. Fine. I always kind of think in the Lord of the Rings, where I don't know if you're that much of a dork, but I like it. So in the Lord of the Rings, you have and I'm not going to talk about movies, I'm going to talk about the book because I don't know if it's even in the film, but there's this scene in the book where Sam accuses Gollum of sneaking, and he calls himself a sneak, and then Frodo says not to take names for yourself, and Gollum says back, he has to take what's given him. And so, okay, I don't know dick about shit or something like that. That's my new name on Twitter. I have to take what's given to me. So I often, kind of put myself in sort of the unjustly wounded Gollum position and like, all right. But it's a signal of sort of defiance to trolls that I'm going to troll them back with whatever they gave me. And so I can't condemn trolling. I would like to pretend, I guess, like the higher perfect James out here would like to pretend that there's like, no, we're always above that. But no, that's not how humans are. And we shouldn't try to pretend we're something that we must raise the level of discourse and always be. No, screw that. Sometimes you got to give people the middle finger with verbally, and sometimes a little trolling is called for. I can't condemn it, but you do have to kind of try to take a mature attitude toward it in both regards, I think.
Yeah, I like your definition of it would be almost like categorizing people as trolls. Like, not that all trolls are the same. Not all trolls.
Right,
Like, there
not
are
all
good
trolls, yeah.
faith. Yeah, there are good faith trolls, and I think it is you kind of while you were talking there, I was like just building this concept in my idea because I never thought about this. I must say, I'm very for trolling, but I have encountered trolls that like are not trolls, or they are offensive trolls. Like you said, there are
Right.
the good trolls that are good faith trolls that are actually trying to drag attention to some subject, and they are trying to do that in a very inflammatory, controversial way. I always saw in that way. I actually like using this because I think it's easier to get people's attention when you kind of poke them a little bit.
Yeah.
But then as soon as I get their attention, I will stop trolling. I will like, okay, let's go serious on this conversation.
Yeah.
That gun control, is that abortion, whatever it is, I stop trolling. It's not
Yeah.
that constant troll that is like, no, I'm not speaking serious to you. I'm like just throwing offenses and insults, and I think it is a good line to draw about this.
Yeah, you have to be able to kind of cut. If all you have is the troll, then it's not really good. But if you can use that to draw attention, and then you can, as I read on Twitter a long time ago, I forget who wrote it. One of these columnists who said that maybe it was Noah Smith, but I don't remember if that's who it was. Said that his opinion is that you shouldn't ever tweet anything that you couldn't back up with an 800-word essay, and so if you throw out the trolling thing to get attention, but then you can actually back that up by knowing what you're talking about, and get serious about it when it's time to. Yeah, there's definitely a use for that to gain attention or whatever else.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that the short amount of words force you to do is like to speak up clearly, and like not so much into trying to, people want to flourish sometimes so much and lose the, like, in the Socratic method. That is one of the things, you have to focus on the question. If you just think about the topic in general, you just lose yourself, and if you start flourishing too much on the text, and I don't know, maybe that's good or bad, but I think it is another thing that in the book you mentioned, that the the little nuances and the little clues of the verbal and the interpersonal conversation and interaction is lost when we're typing. So that is also something that be very complicated when talking about difficult subjects with other people. It's
Yeah,
like,
I mean, the trolling too, right? Because trolling and teasing is something we tend to do in groups, when people are hanging out and they're getting to know each other better and they're being playful with one another. And typically you'll have somebody, say something, and then somebody in the group will troll them by coming back with some kind of snide or some kind of a remark that will catch them, flat-footed or something. And then typically what happens is there's maybe a moment of silence and there's a little bit of stammering, and then everybody kind of grins and the game is up. And so that nonverbal communication, that would happen in person, that's not present in text, and so it really becomes its own monster. But yeah, there are advantages and disadvantages as far as we talk about in the book, that there are advantages and disadvantages to communicating online by text. And the disadvantages are that you lose all of those cues, the tone of voice. We've all seen those kind of memes that go around now. I don't know if meme is even the right word, where it says, it gives you a sentence with like 5 words, like the man went to the store or something like that. And then it's like you put stress on each one of the words and it means something different. The man went to the store. The man went to the store, and it
Yeah.
changes meaning, but you don't get any of that in text. And then,
Yeah,
inflection, whether you,
we are trying to signalize that in the typing now, but it's really complicated. We still
right.
cannot translate properly, or
Yeah,
perform
yeah.
it yet properly. It's interesting to. I want to reach one specific question, but this is an important thing on the book, that is the listen and question more, like the calibrated questions to expose the unread library effect. I
Yeah.
really like that part, and I would like you to talk a little bit about that. I think it's a
Yeah.
very important method, and to maybe put people facing their own cognitive dissonance. And I have talked about to a lot of people that come with this question to me, like,
Hmm.
how do I make that person hear what they are saying, and that they are being hypocritical about their own statements?
Yeah. So the unread library effect is what we called, um, what cognitive scientists have referred to as the illusion of explanatory depth. And the idea is that it's true for pretty much everybody, is that we often think we know more than we know about things. And the reason is, I think I see this a lot with politics, like, whatever happened and with the whole thing with Iran yesterday. Now Twitter's full of PhDs in foreign policy. All of a sudden, the next morning, everybody has a PhD in foreign policy. Uh, so what's happening is that, there are a lot of different things happening, like, Dunning-Kruger and various different overestimations of one's cognitive abilities. I don't know if I've frozen, so I'll wait. No, I didn't. Okay. So what goes on with the unread library effect is people know that people know the answer. So they lean into the fact that something is known and confuse themselves into believing that they know more about it than they do. So a lot of times, one of the easiest ways to get somebody to moderate their really intense beliefs about something is to just get them to keep explaining more and more details about it. And they start to discover that they don't really know how the details are going to work out. So, you could pick any political issue if you wanted that you want, and, maybe it's something about immigration. And I say, well, I think that we should, allow completely open borders or whatever. And you say, oh, okay, so, how does that work? And you just start asking them questions along the, well, who's going to pay for that? And then when this comes up, well, what do we do? And who's going to sort that out? And how do we come up with a structure that a system that can manage what is going to come in? You just keep asking questions, like, I really want to, you're for this, I'm sure you've thought it through. Keep explaining more of the details of how this is actually going to work. And what usually happens is people run into their ignorance fairly quickly, and they realize that they didn't know as much as they thought they knew, and they therefore, often they won't necessarily tell you this, but they will moderate their confidence in their attitudes or their beliefs accordingly, when they realize that they don't actually understand the issue as well as they thought they did. Uh, so it's a really useful way to have a conversation, because you're never really being threatening. You're never really being a jerk. You are asking somebody to explain how something works, or would work in practice. And because it's really easy to have, I think about it all the time. I remember actually Richard Dawkins got in a lot of trouble when Brexit was coming on, and he put out a tweet and he said, how can I be expected to vote on Brexit? Brexit's too complicated for me to understand. And I'm, a pretty smart guy. And if I can't understand it, why should I believe that the average citizen, this should be something that's being handled by actual experts, not by lay people. But of course, every layperson has a pretty strong opinion about an issue like Brexit, about what we should do. But the truth is that they have no idea what will happen. They have no idea, whether leaving is that national sovereignty actually going to work out to be better than, the staying in the European Union and all of the things that come with that. It's very difficult to work those things out. Any big complicated political issue, it's very, very difficult to work out the details, and people don't have them. And so I really, actually, I'm glad you brought that technique up from the book, because I think about it all the time. That's part of why I decided that I wanted to trend back toward being apolitical, is that I realized that I don't know enough to be politically opinionated on much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
I have kind of my intuitions, and some of that's informed by, who I hang out with and just other things that have no good bearing on policy positions that, frankly, I could spend a year studying some of them and I won't understand them. One example that was big in the last presidential election in the US was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I have no idea. I have no idea. I could spend a year studying that and would still have no idea, but I don't have a year to give to that. I have other work to do. I have a life to live. And so a lot of people have strong opinions on things they don't actually understand. And the kinds of questions where it's, just, well, maybe you understand it, but I don't even know what to talk about with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Maybe you can tell me. And then they say, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. A lot of times they've got a couple of talking points and you say, well, how does that work in practice? And, well, I don't know. I just saw it on TV. And, the point there, of course, isn't to, dunk and say, aha, you're stupid. But the point is to say, oh, well, okay, maybe we can figure it out. But I have no idea still. And then the idea really is you want them to go home and think, man, I didn't know as much about that as I thought I did. Or they go tell their friend or their spouse or whatever. Yeah, I was telling James about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and yeah, and he asked me this, and well, how am I supposed to know? You want them to have that reaction, because if they realize for themselves that they don't know as much about it as they thought they did, the data showed that people will moderate their beliefs over time accordingly. And then they discovered it with toilets, which is fun and exciting.
Yeah, I really like that. It was pretty fun chapter. But it is amazing. I really like that because it is the easiest, I think is the easiest performance that requires you to actually expose. Then it doesn't require you to speak. It actually just requires you to ask questions and listen. So it's actually much easier than what we believe when we engage in conversations, and when we are engaged to seek the truth and change people's minds or other. And the point that actually I mentioned with Peter and he brought up, I really liked, was like the idea of winning a debate not always is to change the other person's mind. Is like, if you have a wrong belief, it would be to have your belief asserted. So if you change your mind in the end, you would maybe be the winner, and it is a good perspective, because people nowadays just want to win the debate, to come out feeling like, oh, I present my data, I'm more certain, or I'm more right than the other interlocutor.
No, it's as I guess it was Sam Harris who famously remarks that he doesn't want to be wrong about anything for a second longer than he has to be. So as Pete usually, I think he quotes, I think it's Plato or Socrates or something, where he says, better to be refuted than to refute. The highest level is to you win the most when you end up changing your own mind, because then you become less wrong about a thing.
Yeah. So one of the questions on the book that is very related to you, Peter might have wrote this, is that you took a while to learn the nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Oh,
And
yeah.
How did you do that?
Yeah, that was me. So I grew up in the Southeast, and so we have kind of a lot of country sayings and country folk, and we're sort of salt of the earth people here. And it's really, really common. It was really a close friend of mine who used to say it all the time. to me, is that the reality of life is that nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I really thought about that because, he and I had been very close friends for a long time at that point, and we had, he obviously knew I cared about him and his family and a lot of things, but we did not have the same political views. And I often wasn't very convincing to him whatsoever when we would talk politics. And he would tell me that saying sometimes, and I'd say, it's BS because, I care about you, and I care about these issues, and I want the best for things, but you're not being persuaded by the knowledge that I have. And he said, well, you don't really understand it. You got to think about it some more. And he never would tell me what he meant, but I finally figured out that it's that people want to know that you care about the same values that they have. And then if they feel like you share values with them, then they become interested in what you know, because they feel like you're motivated from the right place. It's not that you have to care about the other person, although that's an important ingredient. If they think that you don't like them or don't care about them, they probably won't listen to you very much. It's not even just that you care about the issue or even the outcome of the issue. It's that your motivation comes from having the same values, and that you are properly you actually do care about those values and share that in common with them. And so looking for that value-based common ground is extremely important if you want to be able to speak with somebody who has very different views than you do. So, maybe if it's a conversation between an atheist and a Christian, it's going to be very, very important to find common ground in whatever value, the issue might be, whether that value is something to do with family, or whether that value has something to do with you mentioned abortion earlier, the sanctity of life, these different kinds of things. If you can't show that you're motivated by a shared value there, it's very difficult to hear and be heard. So that's sort of like fundamental bedrock if you really want to be able to use a discussion where you're going to introduce facts, or you're going to try to tell somebody, how, well, this is how this actually works. And whether it's like the abortion thing. I know you're a doctor, so you can actually go into the details of like fetal development or whatever. And, that's all complicated, and it's also relevant. And, at what moment does it become a baby, and all, there's lots of different
the abortion
stuff
is
there.
so complicated. And it kind of jumps to another point that I think I have talked to people about this on the abortion, and I think it's very interesting. It goes back to the polarization of the subject, because the abortion, when you bring it up, whenever you open your mouth and you give your first opinion, and they manage to find out if you're what they call, and that is what I think, or the name calling, if you're pro-life or if you're pro-choice, and they pick those things and then make the straw man of whatever your position.
Yeah.
And my point was like, I am pro-life, I am pro-choice. I am pro the both things. So you cannot just put me in one thing and exclude me from the other side.
Yeah.
So I think there is more reason, and like you said, like if people are talking about things they do not understand. I've seen a lot of conversations on abortion that people are trying to figure out embryology from Google. So it is, I would say, like, I don't want this credit because I think anybody can talk about anything. But when they want to enter in this level of knowledge, it comes back to the unread library effect. Like, I don't, these people have this authority to talk about this in this subject, using religion and Googling when the baby has a skin.
Yeah.
And they're using that as a strong argument. I'm sorry. It's not a valid argument for me.
Yeah,
For me.
it's not good.
So there's a lot.
Another medical example is the vaccine issue, and there usually the value underneath it you have to be able to find common ground on is good parenting.
It's so incoherent.
Yeah, you really do have to be able to identify, say, with the anti-vax person's view that they are like that it's very core to their identity that they're being a good parent, that they're doing the best parenting job they possibly can against something they're afraid of, and whether that fear is rational or irrational. And so if you can't connect with them on the value of the importance of being a good parent and doing the best you can for your children, if you can't connect with them from that point and then start, there's no way they're going to listen to you. So that's really what the heart of that issue in the book was about. That's why we wanted to include that. It's really important to find common values with people. And we keep talking about how polarized it is, it's really, nobody wants to find common values with people. It's so important that we look for common humanity with one another, that we find values that we actually do share in common, that we actually, another one that, I don't talk about this a lot, but with regard to the book, when you find somebody, even if you disagree with them on a lot of things, but you find some value structure you have in common, you really do need to spend time there with that person. You need to stay in those commonalities and build trust and rapport and friendship, because that's really where, if you want to talk about changing people's minds on important issues, if that's your motivation for having a conversation, friendships are the strongest way, short of falling in love with one another, to change somebody's mind on something. And you have to have that trust and that rapport, and it's only going to happen by lingering in those places where you have shared values.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like that is like even when you're just talking in interview or short conversation, the lack of rapport, it's what damages the conversation the most, because it's so easy to just walk away when you have nothing in common, or when you don't appreciate this person some way. And I also feel the other way around, because I have very different opinions, completely divergent sometimes positions, with some people that I appreciate so much. And that is what triggers probably both of us to sometimes just walk away and stop the conversation, because we want to keep the relationship more than change each other's mind or make the other one understand its arguments. And I think the thing you said before about the creating not just a rapport, a stronger rapport, when you like find this common ground, and a common ground in the values, on the standard values, moral values, it's to connect people like that in a stronger and more civil way.
Right, right. I think it's really important to spend with people more time in your common ground than you do in your differences.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk a little bit about the grievance studies. We closed of an hour. I'm gonna let you go. And so I wanted you to talk about the grievance studies. We talked a little bit in the beginning how it's
Yeah.
important for the academia, but I wanted to maybe go through some specific studies, and let you could tell us maybe what are your if you have a favorite one.
Of the ones that we wrote,
Yeah.
I have kind of like a soft spot in my heart for most of them. There are a few of them I don't like that as much, but I really do have a soft spot for the majority of them in various ways. It depends on my mood, which one my favorite one is. I mean, everybody, and I can't help but laugh very hard every time I look back at the paper about the dog park. And so the paper was, we were going to judge whether or not there's a rape culture by seeing how people react to dogs humping each other, and see if there's any, determination based on their sexual orientation, or whether it was same-sex dog humping or cross-sex dog humping. And it was just the most ridiculous thing. I was actually just kind of appreciating one of the details of it. I almost tweeted about it this morning. I was thinking about one of the details of it. It was actually Peter's genius to say that we observed the dogs for slightly fewer than 10,000, or sorry, we examined the genitals of slightly fewer than 10,000 dogs. And I just realized that there's so much power in making something believable when you make the lie really big. 10,000 dogs is just absolutely absurd. And then you moderate it by putting some kind of just a little bit of humility on it. It's like almost like a short course on how to lie. So you make a really big lie and then you say, well, a little bit less than that, because who would ever say something like it? So, it wasn't more than 10,000 dogs. It was slightly fewer than 10,000 dogs. And I was just laughing about that.
It is hilarious.
I do think that, one of the papers that I haven't talked a lot about, but I found to be one of the most fun to write, was the one about feminist artificial intelligence. It's one of the last papers we wrote. It was one of the last ideas we came up with before we realized we didn't have time to write any more papers. And there's this idea that, there's a lot of stuff in both the popular and academic literature about this. But there's this idea that we're putting our biases, like our patriarchal biases and things, into our algorithms. And so there's, this fear, of course, everybody has, that AI is going to be a monster and it's going to take over and we're going to invent, Skynet or something terrible is going to happen. And so we decided to write a paper saying that the reason that AI is scary is because we're basically making it as a man, and we're trying to make it to be a super rational man, and that's how you destroy the world. And that if we made it an irrational woman
and I guess
instead,
it makes sense for them.
Yeah, so we said that we should make our first super intelligent AI be an irrational woman, and then that was the basis of the whole paper.
No.
Yeah. For feminism. And
It's amazing.
because
a woman in her period.
Yeah, right.
A woman in her period.
Yeah, very hormonal woman.
I have talked about this. You know how hard it is to be a rational woman on her period? If you think harder, like you squeeze your brain and estrogen comes out of it.
Oh man. So I think that paper definitely would have got in because the journal loved it and they were really positive about it right away, and they barely wanted any changes. And so we just ran out of time and it didn't get in, but I think it would have got a lot of attention if it had. So I think, I have a pretty warm spot for that paper. It also is finally one, that's not just full of sexual jokes. A lot of them are just sexual jokes. The whole stick things in your butt so you'll become less transphobic if you're a guy paper. That was fun. The one where it was one about going to Hooters.
Version of Mein Kampf.
Oh yeah. That I can't call that a favorite. That was horrible. That was so hard to do. It wasn't pleasant to do. Very effective, but I actually wasn't really fond. I didn't like doing that one. I think at one point you said that you were talking a little bit with Peter about kind of the interpersonal stuff. I think that paper almost broke our team. It turns out that we had put together a draft and we'd really struggled, and then it was really bad, so we threw that one away and we started a new one. And I mean, that would have been almost in December, and then in April I went on a vacation to China, and I was getting text messages from Helen and Peter while I was in China, where the two of them were fighting to the point where they refused to speak to each other anymore because of trying to edit that paper, because it was so difficult to make Hitler's words work. In theory, it was so difficult to make that paper work. And then it was so funny because we were like, it's not going to happen anyway. Nobody will there's no way a journal will accept this. And then one did. I'm really glad we did that one, but there was nothing pleasant about the process of making that. That was by far, before, during, and since, by far the most difficult task with regard to writing something that I've ever been up against in my life. That was a really difficult project, is to make that paper work. But yeah, feminist Mein Kampf.
And it was so successful.
It worked out. Yeah. It worked out.
What about
Oh, go ahead.
What about the conceptual penis?
So the conceptual penis was that's one of the funniest things I think Peter and I've ever done. So that was actually, before this full project began. So that was Peter and I had done a one-off attempt the spring before we started doing the Grievance Studies papers. So we wrote the conceptual penis very late in the year in 2016, actually, and then it got accepted and published in a pay to publish journal in May of 2017. And then we actually started writing the 20 papers that became so famous later. We started writing those in August of 2017. So that was Pete and I decided to try it to write a hoax to see if we could, and then it got all muddled because the journal was pay to publish and probably predatory and really bad. And so we wrote a paper, though we thought it'd be fun to kind of follow in Alan Sokal's footsteps and write a hoax paper to expose that these people probably don't even know what they're talking about. I think they do know what they're talking about now, to be honest with you. So that was we were wrong about that, and but we decided that the topic should be that penises don't really exist, that they're just social constructions, but they still cause all of our problems, including climate change. And so we wrote, the paper is actually fairly short. It's only 3,000 or 4,000 words, so it's short by academic paper standards. So we wrote that pretty quickly and had a lot of fun. It's really, really, really rude. I mean, it's just a lot of, dick jokes and masturbation jokes and all kinds of rape comments and things like that, like the conceptual penis. Climate change is the conceptual penis raping virgin territory and things in the environment. And it's just like, oh my gosh. So it was really funny, but it really didn't accomplish anything except giving us the idea to expand the project and do it properly, targeting high-level journals with much more serious papers with direct kind of, questions of interest that we wanted to answer.
Was that the first study of the Grievance Studies? Would be
it
the
was
pioneer?
So if we did it, we numbered them 1 through 20 in order. I don't know what order they would come out in, but that would be number 0. It was like the one before all the other ones.
Was the prototype?
It was the prototype model. Yeah, it was the one before all the ones.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's technically separate, and Helen didn't help with it.
Yeah, how did you get your first encounter with this idea of I'm gonna do this? There is the need of this, when or what, if it was a first encounter or if it was something that was the last drop.
So there was a number of things that kind of led to it. Peter and I had already been talking. It was Peter's observation. We were coming out of the atheist scene, and so he had this observation that the scholarly literature in gender studies was like the Bible for kind of the progressive left. They're they can point at this canon of literature and say it's true because it's in that scholarship. And he really had the pretty keen insight on that. And then we started, we were watching our friends, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, etc., getting called sexist and racist and different things. And then we'd get in these arguments on their behalf, or I would on Twitter, and it would constantly be, well, racism means prejudice plus power. And so it's systemic. And then there's, all this more complicated. And I'm like, well, if systemic racism is technically got a different definition than racism, why don't you just call it systemic racism every time? You're like, no, that is racism. And they're like, well, something funny's going on here. So we started looking into the literature a little bit, whoa, there's a lot of this kind of stuff all through their literature. This stuff doesn't even it doesn't even look real. And then there was the Real Peer Review account started on Twitter and started putting out, well, here's a paper that passed peer review. Here's another paper. And there's these just ridiculous things and all this jargon and, something about, going for a walk and, analyzing the social dynamics of going for a walk and just silly, silly stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we were thinking, the literature there isn't just like a religious canon. It's thoroughly corrupted with nonsense. And then finally, the one paper that really triggered us was one about feminist glaciology that said that the science of glaciology needed to be reorganized along feminist terms, which would include putting art projects in it and indigenous knowledges, whatever the hell that means. And we were horrified. And I mean, somebody, Matt Ridley, I believe, wrote a column saying that he still held out that it was a hoax. And so Pete sent me that article and was like, do you know who Alan Sokol is? And we got talking about it. And he said, we should hoax them. If they'll publish that feminist glacier paper, they'll publish anything. And I was like, well, okay. I thought it was going to be stupid and just a waste of our time, but it sounded like it'd be fun. So, all right, I need something fun to do. So that's when we wrote the conceptual penis. And that's how we decided that, something needed to be done. And then the reaction to the conceptual penis and the way that the culture had moved between 2015 and 17 made us, Peter and I became very convinced by 2017 when we started doing the Grievance Studies papers, that the only possible way that this lunacy that's coming about all the gender race stuff, that's just, it's a critical theory ultimately, the only way it could possibly be stopped, because they had so much stuff in the scholarly literature, so many books from university presses, the only way it could be stopped is to show that the whole thing is loaded with corruption and fraudulent nonsense. And what better way than to put fraudulent nonsense through the system and have it come out the other side shiny and nice. So it became a very natural extension of our thinking to just say, well, we tried the conceptual penis kind of as a lark, and now let's do this full on. Let's, write as many papers as we can, spend a year or a year and a half doing it, and just see where we get. And that was kind of it. So it was sort of like a lot of things building up together that made us realize that, and I still think it's true, that without delegitimizing the academic canon that they're relying on, without creating significant doubt around that, at least in people who matter and people who might want to take a second look at it, there's absolutely no way that there would have been any significant fight against it. And I feel that that's been kind of confirmed. Last year, for example, in nursing, there was an academic paper written that examined our project and then asked, could this happen in nursing? Which means the field of nursing is trying to put up prophylactics, or at least on some level. Some people are starting to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe we're being subjected to nonsense too. And ultimately, that's what it was going to take something, and I don't know what else it could have done it to crack open the literature and say, we really need to take a second look at this. Because they've built, and I don't mean to ramble on, but one of the things that the literature and what we called Grievance Studies has done is they've created they've got more stuff out there than you could possibly believe that argues that anything criticizing them is unfair criticism. So if you criticize them, it's white fragility, it's active ignorance, willful ignorance, pernicious ignorance, internalized misogyny, and there's just term after term after term. It's part of the racial contract. If a minority criticizes race theory, they're acting white. If a woman criticizes feminist theory, she's seeking patriarchal reward. It's just thing after thing after thing after thing after thing after thing to avoid dealing with the fact. One of my favorite terms for this is you have white ignorance as the term also, but you also have privilege preserving epistemic pushback. So anybody who disagrees is pushing back epistemically in order to preserve their privilege. So they've made it impossible. Everybody asked us after we came public with it, well, why weren't you more responsible? Why didn't you just do a traditional criticism of it? Because we know their scholarship. Their scholarship is insulated completely against that.
Viable claims.
Yeah. So the only thing you can do when somebody's insulated themselves in a heap of unfalsifiability is make fun of it. The only thing you can do is show that their standards in their disciplines, and I hate to use the word discipline, the standards in their fields are such that the crap we wrote could get published and in high-level journals and could receive awards for excellence in the process. And so at some point you just have to show people like this really it is as bad as we say it is.
Yeah. One of the after Peter's conversation, the interview with Peter, some people really engaged on the comments, and some of the followers left like good questions about that. More like I told you, more in the basics, and that's why we attacked the studies right in the beginning, even talking on the book. But it is an important question for people that just encounter the studies, and I think maybe it could be a common question. And I would like you to talk about this. Peter will reply through message, and maybe we're gonna record it again. So it is his one of his questions and arguments was about the study itself, the grievance studies, the methodology of the way that was displayed, that you performed, and that the journals try to claim not proper methodology because they wanted the subject of the study to know they were being studied.
Hmm.
And I have talked to people because, like, going through university, medical school, we study a lot of methodology, and maybe most of people do not understand the importance of to have the object of the study being blind, to have more honest results on the study. And I would like you to give your stance of it.
Yeah. So in a sense, you can think about what we did as like a quality control check.
Yeah.
And so you could imagine, for example, that I'm going to come in and see if your store is selling alcohol to minors, right? And I don't want to know whether your store is selling alcohol to minors on the day where you think somebody's checking, because you just check everybody very carefully those days. I want to know if your store is selling alcohol to minors on days when you don't know somebody's checking. So I'm not going to tell the person who owns the store that I'm coming in and I'm sending a minor in to try to buy alcohol, for example. Um, because they're going to change their behavior to make sure they don't get caught. And so in this case, if journal editors, it's a very interesting question, to be honest with you. If the journal editors knew that fake studies were likely to be coming in to see if they could tell the difference between real studies and fake studies, the first thing that's going to happen for sure is that they're going to change their behavior in terms of how they check papers to see if they should be passed on to peer review or accepted. They're going to become more stringent than they usually are. So you've already invalidated the point of testing the journals. In particular, they're going to definitely become very suspicious of anybody who's coming without, say, a university affiliation. So we had fake names that we used. We just made people up. So a very easy thing to do would say, oh, well, somebody's checking for this. We don't know which papers are real and which papers are fake, but let's just hedge our bets. And if it's not somebody we know, and if it's not from a university that we're familiar with, let's not accept any paper. And so there are ways that they could have screened very carefully to make sure that the papers would have had a much lower chance of getting in, which of course invalidates the point. The point of the thing was to show that under normal operation, you can get something about dog humping
And
accepted
that
as
is
a
what we were actually expecting, not even to expect that some fake papers are going to be applied at that moment, but they should expect any moment, and that's why they should be more rigorous on their checking the methodology. And
I mean,
also
absolutely.
shows like their fail that is all the time. I think it was just like the studies itself just point out their biases, and there's nothing wrong with the studies itself, and that is what people should be highlighting, instead of like, oh, I don't know, like there is no control of this study.
Right.
Actually, I was going to ask you if have you guys applied the same studies into other journals? Would that be a valid control group?
No, because every journal has what's called aims and scope, and so they publish what they publish. So we wrote, for example, a paper about a feminist version of astronomy. Had we sent that paper to an astronomy journal, there's a very, very, very slight chance that they would have entertained it, but it's extremely unlikely because the paper doesn't actually contain astronomy. It contains commentary on astronomy.
Yeah.
And so the journal would be able to say, well, it's outside of the scope of our journal to publish commentary on astronomy. And so we would gather no information whatsoever by having done so. It wouldn't tell us anything because the journal would just say, well, that's not the kind of thing we publish in general. And it doesn't, not even a comment on the quality of that commentary or the study or whatever. If I sent, if I sent a paper on geology to an immunology journal, they're not going to publish it. It could be the best geology paper ever, but they're going to say, well, we don't publish papers about rocks. We publish papers about immunology. And so it would not have done to send in the same papers to other kinds of journals. Yeah. The question becomes, could we write fake papers that are silly and get them through in a different kind of journal? And, I love the idea that in a perfect world, I guess we could have tried to do that. But do you know what it's like? I mean, just so realistically for a second, do you know how much work we took? We had 10 months to try to write papers, more than one, in a discipline or a set of fields that we have no experience in. So now it's like I'm supposed to have written 20 papers in engineering, 20 papers in physics, 20 papers in biology, 20 papers in... How much shit do you think I can learn in a year? Like, seriously. So, but it's really not the point of the study. The study wasn't to say... our work was not arranged to say that, say, a feminist theory journal is more likely to publish garbage than, say, a biology journal is likely to publish garbage. That would require a comparative study between the two and what acceptance rates of garbage. The point was to say a feminist theory study or journal will accept garbage. That's it. Here's made up garbage that started with the conclusion and wrote tortured logic to get to it. And one of the more esteemed feminist journals in the world decided to accept it. That's all it's trying to say. Mm-hmm. And because we had the methodology of starting with our conclusion and torturing the existing scholarly literature to let us get it published, it doesn't say, oh, well, these journals are worse than other journals. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. It says there's a crisis of faith in these journals. And we can extend that crisis of faith to journals that are in kind of similar lines of thought, because there's good reasons to believe that journals in similar lines of thought are similar. There's no reason to believe that you can extend that to journals that are way outside of that line of thought. So, for example, there's no reason to expect that a physics journal is equally susceptible, because physics methodologies are not similar to the methodologies in the theoretical humanities. Yeah. So anything that falls under the purview of theoretical humanities or even theoretical social science should be feeling the sting of what we did. Anything outside of that, even the empirical social sciences, need not feel any sting from what we did, because they have completely different methodologies. So there's no in medicine, you say there's no mechanism of action that connects the failure in, say, feminist theory or a sociological theory journal or something to, an empirical journal. There's no reason to draw that line. So, if we were doing a different kind of study, a control group or even just different disciplines would have been necessary. But it's really frustrating for me as a mathematician, because I keep wanting to tell people, and they don't know what I mean when I say it. It's like, this was an existence proof. You don't when you do an existence proof, you need one example. And you say, there exists this. Well, we were saying there exists the possibility to publish conclusion first sophistry in the theoretical humanities, which should create a crisis of confidence. in terms of what other things they publish. As another side point, by the way, a lot of fanfare was recently, or a lot of attention was recently given to a paper by an astrophysicist, or not an astrophysicist, by a particle physicist, very famous one at this juncture, Chanda Prescott Weinstein. And I don't know if I said the Weinstein, I don't know if it's Steen or not, but at any rate, she published a paper about white empiricism, claiming essentially that physics is racist. And so this is a paper that's commentary on physics, right? Where did it get published? It got published in a feminist theory journal called Science. It did not get published in a physics journal. So if one of these people who is doing all this stuff in good faith and who is actually a physicist is publishing papers that are commentary on physics in a feminist theory journal, not in a physics journal, it's even more reason to believe that it would be absurd for us to have sent, say, our feminist astronomy paper to an astronomy journal. Although we did actually consider it. We just decided that it was a waste of time to do all the reformatting, and because every journal, people don't know what it takes to publish in the academic world. Every one of your papers has to be formatted according to the house style. Formatting a paper takes a better part of a day, sometimes 2 days. And it's like all they're going to do is say out of scope. So why waste our time? So, I understand where people are coming from with that criticism. And if we were doing a different kind of analysis than we did, I think that they would have a point. Now, what they've done is they've pointed out, if it would give maximum credit to them, that I think said somewhere in the original write-up that those kinds of journals are more susceptible than others. And maybe we don't have the data to support that, but
I guess it raises the skepticism, and that I think it's a good point, because I think it even cross a little bit the idea of the book with the studies when for example, I love to point this out to people, that in the book you guys mentioned that doesn't matter the the knowledge or the intelligence level of the person. We as people, as humans, we are always trying to find arguments or data that actually will reinforce or reaffirm some belief that we already have. It's not the other way around. It's not that we go around the world finding data and then building our beliefs. It's the other way around. We're trying to find data that will prove the things we already believe. And I think that is the mechanism of the theory-based studies, and actually shows that this is a human bias. So any study, in fact, is susceptible to it. And that's why we need to go through the methodologies and see if the biases on those studies, or like if we can't go over them, if we can accept, or if they are so big, if the study is so full of flaws that we actually cannot take it serious. And I think ends up like, we expect the journals to do it, but we know they are susceptible to just accept, to like, it's a valid study, just read it and go through. What brought me to this discussion was exactly that point, because I see there is a lot more pseudoscience, including in the medicine field. And I have debated a lot of people because of those fake data and those woo-woo science. They drive people to wrong conclusions. And like you said, we are all for free speech, but more even for truth. So we defend the free speech, but we know how important it is to spread the real information, because the myths and the lies and those studies that are dismissing reality, they actually drive a lot of people to behave and live differently. So it is important.
Yeah, exactly right. We are wired to seek confirmation, and we have to train ourselves, usually with a lot of effort, if we want to become scientists, or if we want to become rigorous with whatever our work is. We have to train ourselves to seek the counterexample rather than the supporting example. It's a very difficult way to think about things, especially if you get excited or if you think there's a lot of importance to what you're looking at. It's a very important issue. And like you said, if you're having studies that are susceptible to that bias, it's very easy to start misleading people, and then they live their lives accordingly. So yeah, it really matters.
Yeah, I have encountered this problem on the on the no fap movement. It's a
Hmm.
very sensitive topic, but it is a meme that became real. According to some people, it's real because of a lot of pseudoscience that has popped up about it in the last 6 years.
Huh.
In the last 6, 7 years, since all the movements on against pornography and masturbation, it has popped a lot of uh like I said, like, it's more it's anthropologic sociology medicine study that has very flawed methodology, like. and
Hmm.
and people are using, like, for example, one thing that I like to talk is, like, because, like, everybody dismiss the scientific method, that the scientific method is always trying to disprove itself and not the other way around. They
Hmm.
are actually
Hmm.
testing to try to find the results different from what they have. What I see is a lot of people following myths and trying to use their personal experience, that we also know it's very susceptible to placebo,
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
validation. Like, I'm a live proof of God existence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's a weak
yeah.
argument, but for example, yeah, like, for example, what I see is, like, young guys that feel they have better life not masturbating and believe in a lot of lies that those pseudoscience bring up, like. So, and there are a lot of people invested on that, because apparently it is a good business. It is a good business to sell courses to not masturbate
Yeah,
nowadays.
yeah, yeah.
People are making money, destroying relationships, making guys get completely crazy, and with, like, oh, using data, very like very questionable data, or making a grift of studies. They take things that talk about testosterone, talk about men health, and put all together and say, like,
Hmm.
this is my proof that not masturbating will increase your testosterone levels. It's like, so they use a few terms, like, on
Hmm.
medicine, to sound scientific,
Yeah.
and drive a lot of people into uh, a ritualistic movement. It's pretty sad, and I think that is the importance of talking about it, of showing people that, like, not all studies are valid. We have a lot of like I said, a lot of PhD on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, the method always matters. Methodology is absolutely core to whether or not we are getting valid information.
Or they dismiss important data in the studies. I have seen a lot of people that are
Hmm.
for the NoFap movement, this portraying a study that talks about an increase of testosterone levels after 7 days of abstinence of masturbation, and that's it. I have gone through this study. In the eighth day of the study, the level of testosterone goes back to normal without any sexual interaction or masturbation. And they totally dismiss this information and just stop on where it
On
fits
day
their
7.
narrative. So it's pretty interesting to see. And most of people that actually follow because they heard is the Unread library study.
Yeah, yeah,
They
yeah.
heard and they stopped there. They never really go through.
Huh.
If they had gone, maybe they would find out that it's an invalid argument. But it is so, and that's why I think it's so important to talk about your book and your guys' studies. And yeah, uh, I actually have talked to Peter that I'm opening a book club on my Discord channel, and I'll be reading your book first,
Oh,
making
cool.
people to read it, and I'll be reading one paragraph of each chapter per week, because I think it's so applicable to the culture war of nowadays, and with
Oh,
all the
thank you.
little subjects, we have to apply this.
Oh,
It's pretty
good.
good. Thank you very much for coming. Would you
Yeah.
like to leave any message or tell people how to follow you and have impossible conversations?
The easiest way is just on Twitter, like you said, at Conceptual James.
Okay,
That,
so thank you very
that's
much.
really
It
the
was
only thing I
such a
do online.
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and keep going with the good work.
I'm
Thank you
trying,
guys
yeah.
for watching, and don't forget to follow James and keep on the good conversation, on the impossible conversation. I will stop the recording right now. Okay?
Oh,
Bye
okay.
bye.